Good evening and welcome. I've learned to find words that are better than my own. At this occasion, I found a perfect source, an interview with Amedeo that was made in 2011 with several of his own graduate students at Saybrook. There was a retrospective on his career, so I will quote from it. Quote, and this is Amedeo speaking. In the 1950s, humanistic psychology came out in the 1960s. If you went into psychology, you got natural scientific psychology. I happened to go to a school that had a strong research tradition. There was a clinical program, but it wasn't as strong. The prestigious program was the research program, and I went into that program. And with that background then, Duquesne University was starting its doctoral program. The idea was it was going to be a program purely from an existential phenomenological perspective. Adrian von Kamm, who was the founder of the program, was founding it. The way he put it to me when I talked to him was that he was shocked at the state of American psychology that was happening then. Europe was already integrating a lot of phenomenology. So what he said was that Duquesne had an undergraduate program, but at that time, no graduate program. It was open. So he said, quote, let's do one thing and do it well. And our perspective is existential phenomenology. And that's all we'll do for all of psychology and not just for one field of psychology. Unquote from von Kamm. Back to Amedeo. Quote, and I had a kind of professional crisis because I didn't believe I could project over the next 25 or 30 years teaching standard psychology. And I didn't know what to do because I was trained in this. I couldn't go into business. I wasn't a business type. I think many of us can agree with, share those kinds of sentiments about ourselves. And I was really at a loss when I met von Kamm. The more I read, the more I liked. So Adrian invited me to come to Duquesne to develop a research method that would be compatible with the existential phenomenological perspective that existed at Duquesne. Most of the faculty, most of the students were clinicians, so I anticipated that many of the problems that we would be dealing with would be clinical sorts of problems. And so I started to work on the method. Of course, when I went there to Duquesne, my knowledge of phenomenology was fairly limited, very slim. But the big advantage of Duquesne, and I haven't seen this exist again, was that the philosophy department, now here's where I want to quote a little, that the philosophy department was existential phenomenological. There were 10 or 12 existential phenomenologists in the philosophy department. So what I did every semester when I was teaching phenomenology, I also was studying phenomenology. So I was privileged because I got Husserl from John Scanlon, an excellent phenomenological scholar. I got Merleau-Ponty from John Sallis, who is a well-known scholar. He's at Boston College today. And I also got Merleau-Ponty from Al Lingus. Lingus is the translator of the visible and invisible in French. So high-class philosophers teaching philosophy, and I had to translate that into psychology. What were the implications of this philosophy for psychology? But I guess, and maybe this is part of my American character, I felt, well, do something about it, about the method. If you don't see what you want, create something. And so I introduced a new course at Duquesne called Phenomenological Method, where there were about 8 students in the seminar. And I said, quote, I don't know what I'm going to teach you. The interview says he has laughter at that point. I know that I read Husserl, who said you have to describe, so you have to go back to description, unquote. So that semester, it was 1970 at Duquesne, was the first time I taught the method. And of course, over each semester, I kept repeating it. Then I wanted to write books about the phenomenological psychology itself. So now you're going to refer to 2011 now. So after 50 years of doing method, I'm tired. I want to get to a book on Merleau-Ponty, a book on Husserl, where I get into the substance of phenomenological psychology, not just the method. It has been a good thing, but also a distraction in the sense that I couldn't let go of the method. That's where everybody was pulling me towards the method. So I hope at this age to write books on substantive phenomenological psychology what that means and why that would be important to psychology. End of quote.
So you have the history right there.
There you go. That's good. Amedeo, we welcome you back. A return for which you need no welcome, because it is already stitched. You are already stitched tightly by your career into what we live and do here in the department, both psychology and philosophy. It's better to say that your presence here remains a gift that is core to the edifice upon which we build at Duquesne our phenomenological, whether existential or methodological, method every day for each student. And you're welcome back to the library at any time for research on your Merleau or Ponty books. Jeff or I will get you a library card. So, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Dr. Giorgi. What an honor this is for me. Well, I thought we could start at the beginning, or a beginning. Your introduction to Father Adrian von Kamm must have been so compelling that after having graduated from Fordham University with a doctorate in experimental psychology, you then, after meeting von Kamm, read volumes of phenomenology, took courses at the New School for Social Research from Rollo May and Paul Tillich. Tell us about your introduction to von Kamm and
Okay,
to phenomenology.
well, first of all, let me say I will speak the truth as I remember it, but I've already encountered where I swore something was right and I was wrong, so this is memory failures might be there, but this is the way I remember things, and I have to go back even before that. A classmate of mine at Fordham was Father Ed Hogan.
Right.
And we were both, working in the experimental division. Now, he was a good friend of mine, so as I kept taking courses and learning about natural scientific experimental psychology, I was kept being disappointed, so Ed Hogan was my sounding board. I would go to him and, why are we doing this? What's going on? And he would agree, and he was very important for me to bounce off him and get a lot of my frustration out. And so we finished up, and he went back to Duquesne, and I was pretty sure I was going to be a professor all my life, so I became a consultant at Dunlap and Associates, which is a consulting firm that worked on grants, from the government. And I worked on the Nautilus submarine and the Hawk missile somehow as an applied experimental psychologist. And they sent me to White Sands Proving Ground, and I did all the behavioral work on the Hawk missile. But it was all secret work, so I can never talk about it. I don't remember it today, so there's no worry of revealing secrets. Anyway, I understand that the Hawk missile was sent to the Iraq leader. What was his name? I forget. But anyway, yeah, Saddam Hussein. Yeah. Anyway, so I was doing that kind of work, and then one day I got a letter from Father Hogan saying, there's a young Dutch priest here who has a lot of criticism about psychology that you had. You ought to meet him someday. And of course, that was Adrian von Kamm. And that semester, this is before I left Dunlap and went to teach at Manhattan College, von Kamm took Abraham Maslow's place at Brandeis. Maslow went on a sabbatical, and von Kamm was teaching there. And I was dealing with Raytheon, the company that built the Hawk missile. So I was going up to Waltham, Massachusetts weekly. So one of these times I wrote to von Kamm and I said maybe we should meet, and we went out to dinner. And that's when, I really got phenomenology, for the first time. I mean, I was a doctorate, PhD, never heard phenomenology in, 8 years of psychology exposure. So we talked, and that's when he said, well, you're lucky, you're in New York. The New School for Social Research has phenomenologists, and so that's when I went down and took courses from Rollo May and Paul Tillich. And I also met Aaron Gurvich. I didn't take courses, but we would meet maybe once a month and talk about issues and things. So the one thing I remember, I asked von Kamm, I said, well, if I become a phenomenologist, do I have to become a clinician? And he said, no. He says, in Europe, there's these experimental phenomenologists, you don't have to change your background or what you're doing. So I said, okay. So then that's when we met. I had the idea, and then eventually, of course, they wrote up the doctoral program, and it was to begin in September 1962, and that's when I joined. So that's the background to first coming here in 1962. Yeah.
Tell us about the project, your project of developing a method that's appropriate to a human science approach.
Yeah, that's a long story too,
Right.
but you have to also appreciate that most of the faculty here, when I came, there was Tony, Alice Wagstaff, Chuck Mays, Ed Hogan, of course von Kamm, and Dave Smith went to get his doctorate in Montreal. He had been here but then went. So most of them were not researchers, they're mostly clinical, and so I had to somehow deal with that, but I couldn't totally reject my background. And so the question for me was how to conduct research sympathetic to a phenomenological perspective. That was really the big question. And at the time, as I said, I didn't know that much phenomenology because I only heard of it like 6 months earlier, and I couldn't read all that fast. And anyway, understanding what all these authors wrote is another thing. I mean, I must confess, Husserl was off-putting at the beginning. I read this, why do I need to do this? Merleau-Ponty was more accessible. But of course, over time, I appreciated Husserl and I went back to him. But at least at the beginning, it was difficult. But so the first years, I kept hearing about there's a phenomenological method that Europeans practice. Von Kamm kept telling me that. And I kept saying to von Kamm, well, what is the method, And von Kamm said, well, I'm not a researcher, so I really don't know in detail, but I know Linschoten and Buitendijk and Grauman, and these people all do phenomenological research. So I said, well, I have to wait. So what happened is when I got my first sabbatical, which was 1969, I went to Copenhagen because there was a school of phenomenology under Edgar Rubin, the figure ground man, and a Gestalt influence as well. So and there were some people that were still the students of Rubin. Rubin had died, but there were 3 of his former students still there. But the thing was, the Copenhagen, this was in the 60s, 69, so he said, we're so overcrowded. He said, I don't know if we can accommodate you, but there's a brand new university in Aarhus, Denmark. They have plenty of space. So why don't you go to Aarhus and then commute to Copenhagen anytime you have questions. So that's what I did. We lived, my family went over, we lived in Aarhus, and I went to Copenhagen at least, maybe 4 times, and would talk to those people. But what I discovered is they didn't have a method either. That is, they would emphasize description, but there was no one method for how to collect data and use phenomenological criteria in order to analyze the data, which is what method meant to me, So what I did then is I asked them, and anybody I could meet, I tried to smoke out every phenomenological psychologist that was in Europe, okay? And I went to Germany, I went to France, I went to Belgium, I went to England, I went all over the place. And no place did I find this so-called method. Even the Utrecht school, which is what Kamm kept quoting. So I met Buitendijk and I met Linschoten, Langeveld, all the living members of the Utrecht school, and I never got an articulated method. So at the end of the year, my conclusion was that what phenomenological psychology meant in Europe was a critique of mainstream psychology, but no constructive alternative. At least I couldn't find one. So when I came back, as I said, January 1970, I said, well, I guess I'll have to do it, because I couldn't find it, but I did gain some confidence in the fact that nobody else seemed to have a method. So I felt a little bit free in going ahead and risking trying to do a method. And that's what that seminar that Professor quoted here, I had about 8 students, and I said, we're going to analyze data phenomenologically. I don't know what that means yet, but I do know description is important, and let's see what evolves and what comes out. So I kept teaching it every semester, and it kept growing and developing and whatnot. My basis then was this. I was aware that Husserl had developed a philosophical method. Okay? His method is rather straightforward. You assume the transcendental phenomenological reduction. You describe a phenomenon, an example of a phenomenon, and then you determine its essence by means of, with the help of imaginative variation, and you describe the essence. Okay? Well, my first problem was that philosophers tend to describe phenomena and then analyze it. Okay? They do it all the time, right? They sit at their desk, they reflect, they describe something, and then they analyze it, and it's okay. But I'm thinking of APA members, and I'm American Psychological, and I'm thinking of the empiricists out there, And I knew if I did that, if I described my own experience and then analyzed it, I would get one question that would be very difficult to answer and would really throw everything off kilter. And this is the question. How do I know that your description of your phenomenon is not unconsciously in the service of your viewpoint? Well, I think phenomenologically you could get away from that, but to try to tell a group of experimental empiricists that, no, I'm being fair would be very, very difficult. So I didn't want to follow that philosophical path. So what I did then is I thought, well, why not go to others? In the life world, in the everyday world, people describe things all the time. So my idea was to go to others, have them describe different experiences. And then that would become the database. But it's the researcher himself who would have to assume the phenomenological reduction and analyze the data from within the reduction. Okay? So once that happened, and then there's another difference though, is I wanted a psychological essence, not a philosophical essence. Philosophers love to go to absoluteness, necessity, universality all the time. Scientists are kind of in the middle range. If we push things to the really ultimate essence, you lose the psychological interest. You lose the psychological data. Okay? So I didn't want to go that far, so I do eidetic analyses. I still say that the structure I get is eidetic, like the philosophical, but it's middle range. It doesn't go, it's a type rather than a universal essence. Certain way, it's like Weber's ideal type, except that it's phenomenologically established by means of the phenomenological method. So that's another difference that I had to have. And let's see, there was a third difference, but it'll come to me in a minute. So my key point is, I used the philosophical method to form a psychological method that would meet psychological interests. Now, I never said that's the only way of analyzing data phenomenologically. There was a certain expediency to that. Now, von Kamm is the one who challenged me and said, come up with a method that's more sympathetic to the existential phenomenological viewpoint. And, that was, to me, an open-ended question that I didn't know how to answer completely. So I came up with that answer, and that works, and there's a lot of research been done, with the use of that method. But I can imagine there are other ways also of using phenomenological insights to come up with, data analyses and what have you. So that's what I did. I used the philosophical method, and I used my knowledge of research methods to modify it to meet a psychological interest rather than a philosophical interest.
Let me ask more about the latter part of what you just said. How has your background in experimental psychology informed the development and practice of the method? What values from that have you brought?
Well, what I did is a synthesis of phenomenology and my general scientific training. Let me say that at Fordham, which was a strong research program, that's what they prided themselves on, is that we were experimentalists, we're scientists, So I would say that I really got natural scientific training, and psychology was incidental to that. It happened to be the subject matter you used, but basically I got good natural scientific training. As a student, I complained about it all the time. From hindsight, I could see it really served me well because I knew natural science from the inside, and I really understood it well, and I applied it, as I said, as a worker with Dunlap. So nobody could challenge my credentials on that because I differed from it, okay? So I gathered from that general scientific criteria that had to be met, along with philosophical, phenomenological insights that had to be modified. So my experimental background did play a role, and I worked out, I would guess, a personal synthesis between research criteria and phenomenological criteria.
Some of those research criteria being things like rigor.
Well, remember, Husserl even wanted philosophy to be a rigorous science. Huh? So I can't imagine objecting to psychology being a rigorous science. I mean, he critiqued the psychology of his time, but he critiqued it because it was naturalistic, and he critiqued it because he didn't think experimental methods were the way to understand psychology. So I agree, I kind of bracketed experimental. I say now I do research in psychology, I don't do experimentation in that strict sense. So, I mean, what I did is I kind of posited there is a synthesis between phenomenology and research. Now I'm going to find out what it is. I didn't know it a priori. It was an unfolding, development, when I became aware of it. But something that grew out of a synthesis of these two. The more I knew phenomenology, the better, as I was learning it more and more, because I sat in philosophy courses for 25 years. I never missed an opportunity. Every time we had a visiting professor from Europe, I sat in on their courses as well. So I grew in my phenomenology, but I knew my science from training. So it was a synthesis of those two that came out.
What was the contemporary relevance in the late 50s and 60s and 70s of the developing phenomenological human science approach? And the next question I'll ask is how does it continue to be relevant?
Well, you have to come back to the project that von Kamm initiated with the department. We want a psychology that is based upon existential phenomenological philosophy. I'm going to have to talk about some of the things I want to give in my talk tomorrow, but that's and that project, the conflict was this: natural science psychology knew science well, knew naturalistic science, science with the naturalism assumptions. What we posited first with existential phenomenological philosophy was we want to understand the human being in the full sense of the term. We need a philosophical anthropology that does justice to human reality. But if you use the natural science method, there was an implicit and sometimes explicit reduction of the human being, because those methods were designed with nature. Thing was the object and its processes, not humans and their relationships. So we reversed the criteria. We said we want to be faithful to a philosophical anthropology. Now, what kind of science can we invent to do that? Okay, that was the task. That was the project. So we went about inventing the science. At least that's what was my task. Now, again, I want to say this is always the research end of it. There was also a whole big clinical program that also had its own way of using the philosophical anthropology of phenomenology to implement and change clinical procedures. But I'm not a clinician, so I wasn't involved in that part of it, and you have to ask people like Tony about that side of it. So I'm giving you one side. This is not the whole department. It's the research science perspective. So what's the relevance of that? The relevance of that, we think we're more faithful to the human being and to a psychological understanding of the human person. Mainstream psychology thinks it has the answer to that, and they don't see what I would call the implicit reductionism involved in the work that they do. So what is the relevance of that? Well, the relevance is that if you believe in a different philosophical anthropology, if you believe more in the humanness of the human being rather than what he has in common with nature, if you believe in the unique aspects of human being, then you have to do something like we did. Maybe it's not exactly what we did, but something like we did, because you have to respect the uniqueness of human persons and their characteristics. So that is the relevance. Now, why isn't this spreading more? Because natural science criteria goes with the culture. We are like a countercultural movement. We fight the culture.
Still.
Yeah, still, even today. Well, today it's worse if you take into account the idea of a STEM science that APA is pushing. Do you know that idea? That science should be natural science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Now, if you know a human being and then you list engineering, mathematics, technology as modes of understanding a human being, to me, there's such a contradiction, I don't know how anybody can sustain it. But here's APA sustaining it. So how to change that? Well, you have to change the culture too. You can't survive in an antagonistic culture, and let me add that, why I'm so worried is every place phenomenology started, it died. The Utrecht school, the Copenhagen school, Stockholm, where David Katz went, it started and died. And I'm worried, Dallas had one and died. I mean, the doctoral program, not the influence. And it dies either by opposition or by dilution. Sometimes, we can't just be phenomenological. Let's make it postmodern. Let's make it broader some way. And that, too, is a way that it dies. So I don't know what that means, but I think it means that some of the ideas to spread in the culture have difficulty for some reason, although you would think trying to be faithful to the human being in a good way would be easier to communicate. But the idea of science and the idea of natural science is such a stronghold, and of course the philosophy of naturalism that supports that. Many psychologists believe in naturalism, that that's right, that's the correct philosophy. Humans are no different from anything else in the world. So I don't know how to fight that. I mean, I'll always speak for my perspective, But how to convince the world is larger than me.
You've mentioned the during your tenure here and the early days, that there were clinical faculty.
Yeah.
What was the relationship between the theoretical, the empirical, and the clinical emphases of the program? Not asking you to speak about the clinical things going on, but just the way faculty joined and sort of the energy around those three emphases.
I would say difficult. It's an easy term.
I ask because, of course, we're still always trying to figure that out.
Yeah. You know, I have nothing against clinicians. Some of my best friends are clinicians. But there is a real perspectival difference between the two. And I must say that this did cause certain tensions in the department. There was also a tension about, I always believed in rigor, and there were often critiques from my colleagues that, I'm too rigid, not rigor, but rigid. And I always denied that, but they felt that, because I wouldn't let certain things happen. Certain things were okay, other things not okay. But if you're a methodologist, that flows from it, just as in therapy, certain things are allowed and certain things are not allowed. There are borders and limits to that. So I would say that was a problem, and even caused some of my colleagues to get quite angry with me because I was not as liberal in my methodological approach as they would hoped I would be. So it's a difference of understanding of a certain way, and this is in part a tension in psychology, because even mainstream people have this difficulty. I mean, when I was at Fordham, they sneered at clinicians. I mean, the scientists did, and the clinicians didn't understand what we were doing, So it's a division in the field overall, but unfortunately, a phenomenological perspective seems not to correct that easily. Right. I don't know why it doesn't. I would think it should, but I can say experientially it didn't. Theoretically, I can imagine a way it could be overcome, but concretely, it didn't work out that way. So I don't know if that answers your question fully or not. I would say there was always, in my feeling, was that the department did have one gap. And that gap was clinicians from Binswanger and Boss perspective. We were mostly Rogerians that came here. They were from Chicago, and it was Alice and Tony and Von Kamm, even, and Chuck. We're kind of from a Rogerian perspective, and that's okay. I'm not complaining. But there was a gap. If we had a Binswanger or a Boss representative also, might balance the clinical thing a little bit better, but it never happened. We never, in those days, had the money to attract one of those students to come over and be a teacher. We had Boss himself come, as a mini course, but not any Binswanger student that I know. Now, I don't know if that would have helped the tension between research and clinical or not, but my intent, I thought I was being quite liberal in my methodical approach, that I'd let people describe things from the life world, go out to the world, have people describe things, and then analyze it qualitatively. You look for the meaning of the experience, and I would think clinicians look for the meaning of the experience, although a different meaning, and I wanted to be sure that we could establish this meaning in a kind of rigorous way, make it eidetic meaning at some level, but it didn't always flow over well.
You mentioned Boss and the mini courses. What was the significance for the department and the university, and maybe even in general, of the visiting scholars, the tradition of having visiting scholars, and the mini courses, a tradition which we continue today?
Well, I thought it was rather significant. I think Father Murray and I worked that out some way. the idea were there were a lot of other people that were speaking along our lines, but they were expensive. Like Rollo May, we couldn't get Rollo May to come, and Boss, you couldn't get Boss to come for. I mean, I understand Duquesne has changed financially, but when we were here, it was tight. You know, it was not very much loose money to do a lot of other things. So, as we discussed it, we said, you know, if we can't get them, like for a semester, maybe we get them for a mini course. And so what we did is we held back a faculty line. Instead of hiring a live person, we used the money from that line to get 3 mini courses. And the reason for 3 is that a student could take all 3 and get a 3-credit course, you know, so it wouldn't throw the student out of whack. So that's what we did. So we went after the big names, you know, and we got, well, you know the list, Paul Ricoeur, I think, even came, and I forget all the names. And what happened is, on my sabbatical, I went around, I told you, I tried to smoke out every phenomenological psychologist that I knew, so I met a lot of them, and I sized up. I said, well, this guy would be good to come to Duquesne and talk about, you know, what he's teaching. And, you know, and many were, not all were, and I had to make a kind of critical judgment. As you know, we got Vandenberg, and Jan Bauman came, and, you know, each existential phenomenological in some sense. So what I thought, the mini courses, because of our financial status, enriched the program. We had the regular faculty here all the time. You could speak to them anytime you wanted. But with the mini courses, to have Rollo May come for a weekend, or to have, you know, a European perspective, Jan Bauman come and tell you about how he's doing existential therapy in Stockholm, you know, I thought that was all to the good. So I thought that was important. And I hear now that you're down to 1 mini course a year. That's too bad. I think 3 is a good number, but that's you know, I'm out of it.
It was one of your visions for the department to have its own special collection of books and papers on phenomenology, and so here we sit in the Simon Silverman Center, the development, I guess, for 1980. Tell us about the history of this center.
That was rather serendipitous, I would say. I mean, I know Dave Smith wrote up this history, maybe you know it from there, but Erwin Strauss taught it, was one of the visiting professors, came here maybe 3 or 4 times. So I got to know him fairly well. And then I heard he died. And so I thought, well, gee, I think somebody should go down to the funeral, and nobody was going. So I thought, well, I guess I'll go down. So I went down to Lexington, Kentucky, and there was the service at the church and everything. So we came back to Mrs. Strauss, the house. And as I walked in, Mrs. Strauss says, well, I'm glad you came. Would you like some books? I said, like some books? What do you mean? She says, well, what am I going to do with them? So I'm going to give them away to... I said, well, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't break up his library. She says, well, what am I going to do with them? I said, well, maybe some university would want them. And she says, which one? I said, well, maybe Duquesne. Wait a minute. So Father Murray was AVP at the time, and I said, hey, Ed, you know, there's a whole Strauss collection down here. If we pay for the delivery, we can have that whole collection. And so Murray says, yeah, go ahead, grab it. He says, grab it. So I said to her, wait a minute, I think Duquesne might be interested. So I came back, and I talked to the librarian. I forget his name now. I'm getting old, you know. Proper names are slipping. I mean, that's the first thing I noticed. Is going. But anyway, I forget. Do you remember the library? Puglisi, yeah, Paul Puglisi. So I came to Paul, and, you know, I told him, I said, look, there's this whole collection down there, you know, do you have... And they were just building this building, a whole new library. And he says, well, we do have a special collections region, so we could put it in there. He says, is the library open or closed? I said, what do you mean? He says, well, are there going to be more books coming or not? And then I thought, well, wait a minute. If we got Strauss, maybe we get more So I said, oh, open. And then I thought, gee, we could have a whole phenomenological psychology center. Then I thought, how are we going to divide between psych and philosophy? Boy, that'd be hard. Well, why not just make it a phenomenology center? And then that stuck. I just said, okay, let's do that. But now we need an angel. Huh? We need somebody to support this. And I knew Simon Silverman because he was publishing our journal. And he had good relationship with John Dowd, who was head of the press at the time. So I went to John. They said, hey, John, you know Simon fairly well. Do you think Simon would support this idea of a phenomenology center? And I told him the whole idea. He says, well, he might. Why don't we try him? So I said, well, when's the next time he's coming out? And he told me, actually, he's coming out in a couple months. So when he came out, we had lunch with him. And I, very blunt way, said, Simon, we have this idea. If you give us the money, we'll name it after you. And he kind of said, no, I think I can do that. And so that's how we got the money, and that's how Simon...
I never heard that.
So that's how the center got started, a totally serendipitous way, you know. But, you know,
you traveled to Belgium to for the Husserl archives?
Yeah,
as part
yeah,
of this?
to dialogue with them. They were a little resistant about it, but they finally agreed to give us copies of all the Husserl manuscripts, so they're all here. And but I argued, you know, Cologne had a copy and the New School had a copy, so why couldn't we? And so they finally relented and agreed that we could have that. So, but you see, I don't know what it's like today, of course, but in those days, this kind of thing happened, you know. The mini courses came. We had a thing called Duquesne Papers, that students writing papers on phenomenological themes, nobody else would read them. Well, let's put them together and get student papers. We had mini courses. We had summer visiting professors who would come for a 6-week course instead of just a mini course. There was that feeling all the time, what more could we do to improve the department, improve the program, you know, make it stronger, make it better? Because we realized that this was a pretty isolated case, and if we weren't strong and if we failed, it could fail in the world at large. I mean, it was that kind of awareness with us. So we did whatever we could to enrich the program, and I saw all of these as enrichments of the program. You know. So that's how this started.
What are some of your fondest memories of the department, if I may ask?
Oh boy. Well, I guess some of these things that we just talked about, you know, I'd like to remember all the positive things, you know, that we did, and all the collegiality, you know. Tony can corroborate this if he wants, but I thought in the early years things were better and smoother. We were all young, we were all non-knowledgeable, we were all learners, you know. We were, you know, it was a way in which, you know, it was more that we leaned on each other than fought with each other, okay? But as it got longer and longer, you know, little empires were being established, little fiefdoms, you know, were coming along, and then the tension among the faculty, it wasn't so much helpful as a little bit more, well, fightful. I can't think of a better word at the moment. A little bit more tension, and then groups kind of formed, you know, 3 or 4 faculty here, and then 3 or 4 faculty there, and then 2 or 3 faculty here. So when I came time to leaving, that's the way the situation was. And that was one of my motives, not the only one, but one of my motives for going elsewhere. I've been here 25 years, that's a quarter of a century, you know, and I did ask, do I want to spend my whole life in one institution? And I said, not really, if I can change it. So that's why I also started looking. Not the only reason, I will insist. There are personal reasons as well, and some professional reasons. So I would say it's the early years, the sitting on courses. I remember many, walking up and down in front of the row houses when they with Von Kamm, talking about what else we could do. We would pace one way, pace back, all was opened, and all this, these are like possibilities, how to bring them into actualities, what could we do, what was possible, not possible. All that, was very good. And, also, while Von Kamm started it was all his idea, and nobody can gainsay that. But he was better at starting things than at developing them. So he started the Institute of Man, then he changed that to Institute of Spirituality. He started the Religion and Personality MA program around 1958, but then he started, the psychology program. But, he left us very quickly. He left, I think, around 1963, 1964, and went into the Institute of Man, and that was a bit hard. I tried to talk to him, why don't you make it gradual? Why don't you, do it slowly rather than this abrupt, I said, you're the only name we have. I said, if you leave us, what are we going to do? He didn't budge, though. He said his heart was always with religion. And while he had religion and personality, he wanted a spiritual, aspect. So that's how he justified that he pulled out, and then we had to pull ourselves together. Another fond memory, even though it was a crisis, was when existential phenomenologists were all going to leave in the philosophy department. I don't know if you remember that, Tony. When what happened is Lingus was going to leave, and Bolin was leaving, and almost all the existential phenomenologists were leaving. I forget what the dispute was about.
Had to do with the chair of the department.
The chair of the department, that's right. He was going to change the orientation to more a general analytic, maybe philosophy. So they were all going to leave, and then we said, well, where does that leave us? We're dangling because we felt still that we needed the philosophers to help us establish this. And I don't know if you know it, but we all marched, and we had signs, and we marched around the campus that save phenomenology. Was a big thing in those days. So that was kind of good. And then what happened, and many of us were thinking of leaving, and there was even a department in Canada that would have hired all of us, about 6 or 7 of us, if we all wanted to go there. And I was considering that. But then we heard they hired John Scanlon, they hired John Salas, and they hired Andre Schuer. And so we realized new phenomenologists were coming in. So it was not a real loss. But I think that was one tension that we really, fought and were adamant about. But it was, fortunately, the crisis was resolved. And these new philosophers were good, so it was not a diminution of philosophy. Other than that, it was more, I enjoyed developing the Foundations course, the Foundations of Psychology as Human Science. That didn't exist before, and so I liked developing that. That part was good. I enjoyed developing the method in my seminars with the students, every semester. That was sort of good memories. And so I tend to try to recall the positive, rather than the negative.
Right.
But there was negative too. But.
What advice do you have for us as we steer this department into the future? What is your hope for us?
Stay phenomenological. Would be my advice. It's needed in the world, I think. I think both the psychology and the philosophy that would see my point, and what we try to do in my talk tomorrow we'll try to show. You can go to the major philosophers, the big four: Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Husserl, and Heidegger. And I think you could resolve the major problems of psychology almost within, if you throw all four together, you definitely could solve all the major problems of a good human psychology. I always speak of human psychology. There is an animal psychology, but that has different issues. So I would say with those four thinkers, you can really make a good psychology. The trouble is, of course, to learn all the philosophy first and then apply it to the psychology. That's really what is necessary. You have to know the philosophy and then apply it to psychology. It doesn't mean imitating. You do have to be creative in applying that philosophy to psychology. But first you have to know it well. So how does a student know the philosophy well and then know psychology well? That's a huge
Big
task.
statement.
It's really big. I understand that. So I understand compromises and deficiencies and faults. But that would be the ideal if that could be done. And of course, in the early days, all the students had to sit in philosophy courses as well, from the philosophers, And then, okay, now what are the implications of that? Always the key issue. What are the implications of the thought of Husserl, of Merleau-Ponty, of Heidegger, of Sartre, for the practice of psychology? What are the implications? If we follow them instead of empiricism, what would psychology look like? That has to be worked out. So I would say we really need that. And remember what I said, every place phenomenology started, it died. Utrecht School, Copenhagen, Stockholm, South Africa, Rhodes, wherever it started, it's like it can't get past one generation, almost. So if you believe that that's a vital function in our society at large, if you think the contributions of that kind of thought help humankind and help us understand, human relationships better, keep it alive. That would be my advice.
Thank you. Addressing our current doctoral students, is there anything that you'd like to tell them about the department that was, or their future?
I guess the future's tough.
Yes.
People always ask me, what do you tell a student, who says, hey, I like what you're saying, I like what you're doing. But if I follow that, do I have a career? And my answer always was, yes, with difficulty. It's not impossible, but it's not this greased slide that if you were a mainstream psychologist you would get. It's with difficulty, and it's almost like you have to have some other specialty to get the job with and hold phenomenology back. So I'm a clinician, but I also happen to be a phenomenologist, and you, whatever the situation allows you to come out with, you can do. Like in the early years, again, with all the state hospitals around here, our students did modify the way that they practiced.
Yeah.
They were hired as clinicians, but they brought in phenomenological insights and attitudes and perspectives to the extent that the situation allowed it. So I would say that is sort of what you have to do. You have to know mainstream psychology too, enough to get a job, but you have to be critical of it from a phenomenological perspective. So and I can understand not everybody maybe has the talent to juggle this thing, and then, if you have to follow your heart, then, go do it. But if you can juggle it, we need you out in the world as a psychologist. So that would be I know it's difficult and I know it's hard, but not impossible. It's just difficult. And the thing is, I often found many students who would have loved to have been in the program, but instead of choosing psychology, they chose sociology, or they chose history, or they chose English or literature, something else where they could be freer to express what they believed in, because psychology was too constrained. So, and there were some differences. Don't forget, when we started, there was no humanistic psychology. There was no good philosophical psychology. There was no Division 32 of humanistic psychology. We helped create a lot of those things that makes it a little easier today, but still, there's a strong cultural bias against our perspective, mostly because it's not understood. and it takes great effort to understand it. I remember when Erwin Strauss came here one time, and he was saying such good things and all, and I'm saying, where are your students? Why don't you have more students? Why aren't they all following all the things you're saying? He says, well, I don't have any because it's too difficult. And I thought, oh, that sounds like an old man's excuse, you know. But you know what? He was right. He was right. Now that I'm at his age and all the experiences I had, it is difficult. So that's part of the problem, you know. And difficult in the sense that maybe there's no reward at the end as well. Like, do I get a job? Can I really, even if I get a job, you know, can I practice what I believe in? You know, Fred Wirtz is at Fordham. He's a loner, and but you know, he has real difficulty, you know, teaching phenomenology, which is his first belief, and he's got to do all other kinds of things because he's not totally free because he's a loner. He's the only one there. So it is hard.
Well, wrapping it up, is there anything that I didn't ask about that you wish that I would have? Anything that...
Gee, spontaneously nothing comes to mind at the moment. I don't know if there's anything that I left out of my own personal history of you know, related to Duquesne and the department. You know, I was chair for a while too, but that too was a result of crises. Alice Wagstaff married a priest, so she had to leave. She was chair. Then Ed Hogan became chair, and he left to get married, and so so then he came to me and said, "You'll have to be chair." I said, "I don't want this." He said, "No, you really have to step in." So I did step in, but I didn't want it. And even at Saybrook, I served as dean under crises a couple times, but you know, administration is not the solution. I mean, you stop thinking as an administrator, I think. I'm glad he left. He doesn't. It's really hard because you're so. I would say you're busy with trivia as an administrator almost all day long, and I got nothing written during my years as a dean or as a chair, so I wouldn't advise that. But sometimes, you know, you can do it as a contribution to the department as a whole. You know, you help out when there's a need to do so. But other than that, there's nothing else that I, you know, can, unless a question prompts me. But
right, we'll open it up to questions. But thank you so much. This was really enjoyable. Thank you.
Anybody?
Questions?
Good question.
I have a question. So how do we, if we're conceptualizing our work here in our department, sort of countercultural, do you have any suggestions for, you know, how we can keep this alive, how we can keep this sort of countercultural movement alive, recognizing that we can't necessarily build just one thread, that, you know, the way the department is moving and with incorporating maybe 2 or 3 new faculty, that, you know, we're already, you know, branching off into separate, you know, diverse threads. So how do we keep a movement alive, recognizing that this is the trade-off of moving forward?
Yeah, well, first you would hope that there's no diversions, but if that's already existing, there's not much you can do about it. We did have early on, I forgot to mention, David Smiley, who was very much an oppositional thinker. He came here as a phenomenologist, but since he was surrounded by phenomenologists, he kept fighting us, and you know, it's okay, but it happens. I would say, you know, you have to be sure then that the constructive alternative is being developed regardless of the circumstances. And if you are a loner, or if you are a small group, band together, Doesn't mean you all have to think alike, doesn't mean you all have to follow the same philosopher, but as long as you're within the basic phenomenological camp, like I have a lot of debates with Heideggerians because I'm mostly a Husserlian, but I still respect what they're doing because he's part of the group. That's okay. There's plenty to choose from. And you have to keep your spirit up somehow. And I don't know, there might be a lot of different individual ways of doing that. But that is critical, that you stay together in some way and you tolerate differences within the group, as opposed to differences outside the group. And you just keep hoping that the future might have more of you around. I don't think it'll ever die, okay? I think it's here to stay. But it'll never be mainstream. I don't think at least unless the culture changes maybe 100 years from now or something. But it won't be mainstream, but it won't die. So you have to understand that that's where you'll be in some place between those two extremes. And I might add, by the way, phenomenological philosophy is in a good place. There's lots of good young American philosophers carrying on this tradition. And I would say that the articulation of phenomenological thought in contemporary philosophy is clear and it's quite good. If you read Luft or Zahavi or some of those philosophers, they're articulate and they're on target. They know what they're talking about. They're quite good. So it'll never die in philosophy, certainly. In fact, it's quite strong. So I would say turn to those younger philosophers as the sources, maybe instead of Husserl himself, Husserl requires commentary. I can honestly say if I read Husserl on my own, I wouldn't have gotten him. I simply wouldn't have gotten him. I needed Scanlon there to interpret him for me, or I needed Sallis to interpret Merleau-Ponty in a certain way. And that really is what helped. And that's why when we had that crisis and we didn't want the philosophers to leave, because we understood that phenomenology is primarily a philosophy, and we have to, understand the philosophy, then apply it, to psychology. So I would say, but you can read these younger guys like Zahavi and Luft and Carr and some of the others, and Casey, in a good way. They're reliable and they articulate it well, and in more, I would say, contemporary English. Some of the older are not. So there's hope in that. I think that the articulation of phenomenological thought is becoming clearer and better than when we started.
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really helpful.
Jeff? Question to follow up. What are your thoughts about, you mentioned the big four,
Yeah.
who, of course, I think everyone here respects and admires. What about, might call third generation, Husserl's first generation, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, Heidegger second generation, sort of third generation, I'm thinking of Ricoeur, Levinas, Michel Henry, Derrida, a little more heretically maybe. What are your thoughts on what they have to offer, psychology and phenomenological psychology?
Well, I've read them, but I haven't specialized in them. I spent my work with the first generation, mostly Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, and Sartre. When you're a psychologist rather than a philosopher, you have to know contemporary psychology as well. So you're always balancing. So I thought if I could know two or three well and dialogue with contemporary psychology, that's pretty much my contribution. So I'm not saying that Levinas doesn't have something to say, or Henri, or the others. It's just that those are the ones I focused on. Now, if somebody wants to focus on them, or even on Zahavi, for example, I would say anyone who focused on Zahavi and picked up his ideas and applied them to psychology, that's good work. I read Zahavi, I don't, situate myself within him because I'm with Husserl, and I see him mostly articulating Husserl, so I don't have to do that. But I wouldn't deny that, although I would put Ricoeur with the second generation, not the third, and same with Levinas. I would kick them up a level. But sure, if you want to, I think George Kunz follows Levinas completely. That's okay, I don't see Levinas as, out of the context or out of the movement at all. So, but maybe someone from this generation could do that. But belonging to that first generation, it's just too much to take them all on.
Roger.
This is not a question, but it's just a statement which I'd like to have here while you're being interviewed and on the record, which is I want to tell you and to tell everybody else here that when you came to Rhodes in 1982 and took me and my colleagues page by page through the structure of behavior, it's one of the great privileges of my life.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you. Any other questions? Well, I think there's goodies out there waiting for us.
Thank you so much,
You're
Dr. Giorgi.